Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Wood, and my keystone is called As Democracy Falls, the British and French Press in Hitler's Germany. And I was advised by Professor Zatlin as well. Thank you for being here today. So first, I'm just going to give a little outline of my presentation. So I'm going to go through the background and significance, and then discuss the role of the press, go through my methods, some key findings, conclusions, and implications. So the press has been a big topic of discussion lately. We've seen the term fake news go from meaning news that's not real to kind of an umbrella term for the press in general and kind of pitting the press against the public in general. And most news outlets, from Fox News to MSNBC, have been called fake news at one point or another. And many newspapers and other media sources have come to defend themselves for this, saying that they play an important role in democracies. So we saw the Washington Post's "Democracy Dies in Darkness" slogan, as well as the New York Times' Truth Campaign. And kind of in conjunction with this, we've seen a lot of more right-wing, extreme right-wing, xenophobic and nationalistic leaders come to power and we've also seen a lot of nationalistic groups and movements happening. So we had Viktor Orban in Hungary, Andrzej Duda in Poland. We had the popularity of Marine Le Pen in the 2017 French elections, and we saw the popularity of the AfD in Germany last year, as well as Brexit in 2016. So the fact that the press kind of relies on democracy to remain free kind of led me to wonder how a free press reacts to undemocratic forces. And this is a really difficult question to examine when you're looking at the press in a country that's no longer democratic, because one of the first actions that authoritarian rulers take is to abolish the freedom of the press. And just to clarify, none of the countries that I mentioned before are no longer democracies. They're still democratic. However, there have been these sort of undemocratic or less traditionally democratic trends. And so I chose to look at a historical case, and I chose to look at two countries that did have a free press. So I chose to look at Hitler's Germany in the 1930s and looking at how the British and French press reacted to his rise to power from 1933 to 1939. So just a little bit of background on the role of the press. There are four main functions that the press serves from a liberal democratic perspective. The first is a political purpose, so it needs to report and editorialize information accurately. Secondly, it has a perspectival function, so it just reports on various aspects of human life and culture. Third, it has a historical function, so it can remind the public of things that happened in their past that, short-term collective memory might forget by using historical memory. And finally, it can create models by amplifying certain individuals and ideas. And my thesis focuses primarily on the first and third functions. So just a little bit for my methods. I chose to take a kind of narrow perspective. So instead of looking at in general how the British and French press reacted, I chose four particular events and two newspapers from each country, because there were so many newspapers at the time and so much happened, it would be very difficult to have to cover everything. So I chose to cover four main events: the March 1933 Reichstag elections, the Anglo-German naval agreement from June 1935, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in March of 1936, and finally the occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. And the four newspapers that I chose varied politically. So on the French side, I chose Le Figaro, which was a right-wing, very popular newspaper, L'Humanité, which was the official newspaper of the French Communist Party and had ties to Comintern in the USSR, but it was very widely read by people who weren't necessarily communists. And then on the British side, I chose the Manchester Guardian, which is now the national newspaper, The Guardian, and it also, though it was localized to Manchester, had a national reputation, and it was more left-wing. And then finally, I chose the Times in London, which was one of the preeminent daily newspapers of the time, and it was fairly right-wing as well. So a few key findings. For the March 1933 Reichstag elections, which took place about a month after Hitler was appointed chancellor, the British press was overall not very concerned with the long-term implications of Hitler's rise to power and consolidation of power, but there was sort of a preoccupation with the French reaction to things, and they also thought that Hitler would not necessarily be as extreme after he achieved full power as he was before, that he might have used this extreme rhetoric while he was trying to gain power, but he would sort of calm down afterwards. And in conjunction with that idea, there was this idea that Germany must, quote unquote, break its chains. So after the Treaty of Versailles in World War I, Germany had been very oppressed, as they viewed it, by these international agreements. Whereas on the French side, they were a bit more concerned, and there was an idea that Hitler would turn to foreign, from domestic to foreign focus. And along with the breaking its chains idea, the French press thought that Germany was going to, quote unquote, stretch her claws. Then 2 years later, when Britain and Germany had the Anglo-German naval agreement, this was viewed highly positively by the British press. The only criticisms of it were the fact that it wasn't as good of an agreement as it could have been for Britain, not the fact that they made an agreement in the first place. And they even praised Britain for aiding in Hitler's renaissance of the West. And in contrast, on the French side, there was a lot of anger that France was not invited to the naval talks, and there was this idea that British politics were founded on the idea of violation, and there was some worries that Hitler would gain popularity in Paris if he had support in London. So by this point, Britain just really wanted to work within the existing international system, and they didn't recognize the sort of game that Hitler was playing with them. And then when the Rhineland was remilitarized in 1936, this again was viewed fairly positively by the British press because, again, they thought the Treaty of Versailles was unfair to Germany, and the Rhineland was part of Germany and should be allowed to be treated as the rest of the country was. And there was an idea that Britain should support these moderates within Hitler's government, but I don't believe there were any moderates in Hitler's government by this point. I don't think anyone would say that either. And again, this idea that they should keep the door open for negotiations. So it was reflective of the British appeasement policy that existed at the time. Whereas on the French side, again, by this point, Germany was perceived as a much more direct threat, perhaps due to the proximity of the Rhineland to France. And the French press recognized that Hitler viewed treaties as, quote unquote, scraps of paper. And then finally, the last event that I chose was the occupation of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. And this was kind of a turning point for the British press. And this was primarily due to the fact that now non-Germans were under control of Hitler, whereas previously Hitler had kept promising that he only wanted to have a German ethnic empire. Now there were Slovaks who were under German control. And both the Times and the Manchester Guardian felt that this threatened all of Europe's security in general. And though they were not angry at Hitler for repudiating previous treaties, they were angry that he repudiated the Munich Agreement. Again, on the French side, there was just even more concern for the growing tension in Europe, and this was similarly due to the fact that there were non-Germans under German control. And on both sides, there was a fair amount of concern for the treatment of Jews in Czechoslovakia. And by this point, France just feared for its own territorial integrity. And there was this idea that Hitler, as an authoritarian leader, he surprised, but he didn't improvise, whereas democracies tend to be much more reactive and not proactive, and they improvise but never surprise. Separated from the continent, both physically and culturally, and the beliefs about the Treaty of Versailles' unfairness. And finally, amongst the right-wing upper and middle classes in Britain, there was a lot of sympathy for fascism, and I found this to come through a lot in the Times' reaction, not so much the Manchester Guardian. And this is a quote from the Manchester Guardian in 1938, and it's talking about the British public in general, but I think it informs what I saw in the right-wing British press reaction. So this says, "The spectacle of a strong man imposing his will and giving order and unity to a whole people made such an impression on certain conservative elements in English society that he became something of a hero. Public men paid court to him, ministers and ex-ministers treated his ambassador as a confidential friend, and the impression was spread abroad that his aspirations were not those of an ambitious and unscrupulous man, but of a simple patriot." So a few implications for this. There have been a lot of comparisons between current right-wing or far right-wing, quote-unquote, less democratic leaders and Hitler. These have been made by historians, political figures, and journalists alike. And the fact that these figures are making all of these comparisons, whether or not they should be made or not, I think is very significant. And overall, it's very difficult for the press to recognize that the signs that a democracy is eroding, especially when we have this historical memory that plays a role in how we perceive things. And it's still more challenging to recognize this when a situation has happened previously. But overall, I think it's really important to study the way that the press, a free press, interacts with other forces in a democracy. So if anyone has any questions, thank you.
sorry that I missed the beginning of your talk, which is very interesting and on many levels. I guess one of the things I was wondering about is you're advancing some pretty ambitious generalizations about the British press, but as I remember it from, there were very serious differences between the Daily Telegraph and the Times and the Guardian about these things. There are differences between the so-called quality newspapers and the tabloids. And also, I think you have to be careful in advancing a large generalization about the British middle and upper class sympathy for Hitler. As I understand it, the strongest cohort in which there was significant sympathy was a minority of the British aristocracy, which traditionally had very strong ties to German royal houses, German aristocracies. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Regarding the differences between the newspapers, I probably didn't differentiate them enough in this presentation. I just looked at the Times and the Manchester Guardian. And yes, you're right that the Times was very different from the Manchester Guardian. There were, earlier on, they were more similar, I would say, and then by the time it got to the Rhineland and Czechoslovakia, there were some more differences. And with the sympathy for fascism, there were a lot of individuals in, who were close to the Times who sort of, like you said, the aristocracy exhibited some of those sympathies for fascism. So yeah, I don't want to make huge generalizations. Just for the purposes of this presentation, I probably overgeneralized a bit. Questions? Yes, Mike.
What was happening to the press in Germany?
So basically, as soon as Hitler came to power, there was complete suppression of the freedom of the press in Germany. And like all newspapers were fully regulated by the regime. So there was not really any freedom of the press. There were still, like foreign journalists were allowed to report in Germany, but there were some cases where many were expelled from Germany for angering the regime. Any other questions? No?